Two. There you go. Welcome, Amber.
Thank you so much. Hello, it's such an honor to be here. I'm so excited. This is truly my favorite program to give. It's really looking at you know, the Wizard of Oz, the wonderful Wizard of Oz. Raise your hand if you know the story. Right? So this is something that's so cool because I talk to people from all over the country, kids of all different ages. And even if they're not familiar with the specific like movie or but they know something like There's No Place But Home. It truly is an American fairy tale. And it's something I grew up with, but it's something that I didn't realize these until I started researching the homesteading and women's suffrage themes. So we're going to look at homesteading and women's suffrage themes through this American classic. And after we do this, I think that you will never have a time when you don't see those themes when you hear of this story. So I know some of you had a chance to be with my coworker Rob. I am at Homestead National Historical Park. We're a National Park Service site in Beatrice, Nebraska. We remember the many legacies of the Homestead Act of 1862. We have two different visitor centers, two historic buildings, and 3 miles of restored prairie trails to remember this story. We have a 22-minute movie that tells the homesteading story from the perspective of descendants of homesteaders, but also Indigenous people to remember the legacies. So a quick background into the Homestead Act of 1862. The Homestead Act was a chance to earn 160 acres of land for any man, but also any woman if she was a head of household. So that meant single, widowed, divorced, or abandoned. There was a case here in Nebraska specifically where the husband left but stayed legally married. Her and her children proved up because you had to live on the land for 5 years, plant a crop, and build a shelter. And he tried to come back and take that land. And the community said no. She did the work. So she ended up getting that. You had to be over 21 years of age. This passed in the American Civil War. So at the beginning, it was really this idea of you could have never borne arms against the United States or supported anyone who did. And so anyone who fought for the Confederacy or supported the Confederacy couldn't be part of it. Now, starting in the 1850s, they're really debating in Congress the Homestead Act, but the South starts seeing as a spread of Northern ideals. And so they block it. So it is in the midst of the Civil War that the Homestead Act passed. And it passed on May 20th of 1862, but they purposefully did not have it go into effect until January 1st of 1863. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation that Abraham Lincoln declared that any person who was enslaved in the rebelling states would be seen as free. It was preliminarily announced in September of 1862, but it also didn't go in effect to January 1st of 1863. So they both went into effect January 1st of 1863. And it is truly my opinion that this is one of the most significant pieces of legislation in American history. Many historians agree with that. 10% of all land in the United States, because later there was a Southern Homestead Act. So all the brown ones, all the brown states had land that was homestead. 270 million acres. So if you think of California, Oregon, and Washington, and you add Idaho. Now, you didn't have to be an American citizen when you started. You had to declare your intention to become an American citizen. You had to be an American citizen before you ended it. So people came from all over on the premise of the Homestead Act. As many as 1 in 3 Americans are descended from a homesteader. And I know from doing my research that I have family that came from Germany and Sweden that wouldn't even be in this country without the promise of the Homestead Act. So this is going to be the first time I break out in song. So I'm going to sing a song, and I want you to raise your hand either physically or virtually if you've heard this song before, okay, when I'm done. Oh, give me a home where the buffalo roam, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day. Home, home on the range, where the deer and the antelope play, where seldom is heard a discouraging word, and the skies are not cloudy all day. All right, so a lot of people have heard that song. So that is Home on the Range. And it is the unofficial song of the, thank you. It's the unofficial song of the American West. It became the official song of the state of Kansas in the 1940s, but it started as a poem by a Dr. Brewster Higley when he was reflecting on the beauty of his homestead claim. And it's a primary document, right? It's a whether it's a letter from history or a photo or a historical newspaper, something from the time period that gives us a glimpse. And we can learn a lot about the Homestead Act through this piece of pop culture that's still with us today. The poem was called My Prairie Home. Oh, give me a home is the lyrics. Back in the beginning of the Homestead era, in the 1800s, in the late 1800s, the second half, the American dream was a home, a place that belonged to you. Homesteading was a chance to earn land. It was $12 filing fee and a $6 fee at the end, and you had to do all the requirements. But it cost more money to rent 1 acre of land for 1 year in Great Britain than it did to earn 160 acres here in the United States. And most of these different European countries, you either were noble or it was passed down to families, and you had to be the oldest son. So if you weren't a son or you weren't the oldest son, you weren't going to get land. But you could come here and have a chance to earn that. And it truly became part of the American dream. And I do think that that concept, as we talk about the Wonderful Wizard of Oz, one of the reasons, so in this book, L. Frank Baum published it in 1900. And in the beginning, it actually talks about how it's an American fairy tale. And that it's not scary when actually the book itself is quite scary. But yeah, we got some nods. But it truly is, I would say, the most American fairy tale we have. And the story in the United States has really stayed with us. And I think that this concept of home, but also individual rights and women's suffrage, plays a role in the continuation of this story. Okay, so how did I come up with this program? So I have lived in the state of Nebraska my whole life. I have an undergraduate degree in history. I have a graduate degree in historical studies. I've also always done musical theater. And so I love, because I think that pop culture really shares so much about history, and we can learn so much about how the past affects the present by looking at pop culture, that I can also use my musical theater like I do in this presentation for you. But I read a lot. And the first time I was introduced to the idea of homesteading being present in The Wonderful Wizard of Oz is in Richard White's. He was a Stanford historian. He wrote Oxford's History of the United States volume on the Gilded Age. And so looking at this book is the first time he said that The Wonderful Wizard of Oz is the Gilded Age in a parable. And that's when I was like, oh. And so then I started doing more research, because previous historians, which he disagrees with, mentioned about, the William Jennings Bryan and the gold standard and the silver standard. And certainly that was part of the time period. But with this clear connection to the Homestead Act was the first time. So then I really started looking at other books as well. But at the same time, our former historian, Jonathan Fairchild, in 2020, for the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, looked at the correlation between homesteading and women's suffrage. Because women could qualify in their own name, is really the only main thing that happened for women in the second half of the 1800s, but it was huge. 10% of all homesteads were women in their own name. And even those who went out with their husband, they're community creating. And it's always I always try to remember, like, the reason why they were able to create these communities was because that land was so recently taken from indigenous people. But they were able to build the schools and build the churches and then say, hey, I get a vote in that. And then these women who were homesteading in their own name were property owners. So they were taxpayers. So they were able to leverage no taxation without representation. And so really, I was in this mindset of reading this research and interpreting this research when I started looking more into L. Frank Baum. And I read The Real Wizard of Oz. And that's where it really talked about his very clear ties to women's suffrage, and his mother-in-law, which we'll go into, and also labor in the Midwest, and as part of this time period. So all of these different books. So this research that I'm presenting to you, I know Rob touched on earlier, is really a combination of all these things. So it's based in research, but really realizing through telling the homesteading story how compelling it is as a complete narrative, not just different parts of other stories. Okay, so the American fairy tale we talked about, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, was presented in 1900. L. Frank Baum was up until he was born in the 1850s, and he was very much somebody who wasn't always successful. He would start newspapers and they would fail. He would start a store and it would fail. But he saw people coming back from the American Civil War. He was living in New York City, or not New York City, he was living in New York State, where he grew up, working at various businesses in his parents' business. He didn't actually start writing until he was about 40. But The Wonderful Wizard of Oz is his key shining achievement. But to truly understand that, we have to look through the lens of his experiences. So, women's rights and The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. Now, by the time I saw The Wizard of Oz, the movie, right? I saw the movie ever before I saw the book, the 1939 Judy Garland version. By the time I saw that, it was one of those situations where I was young, but I knew I could vote, right? There was never a time when my mom couldn't vote. And her mom, who was born in 1924, there was never a time when she couldn't vote, right? So I, loved the story and it resonated with me. But I couldn't imagine how powerful it would have been in 1900, 20 years before women could vote, that they have a strong female lead, which we'll talk even more about in the next portion. But Dorothy, she's leading this story. And the witches, 2 witches. Being a witch doesn't mean you're good or bad. Being a witch means you're powerful. Who's supposed to have power in Oz? The wizard, the man. But he's a bumbling fake. What makes you a witch? That you're powerful, that you have magic. You could be good, you could be bad, but you had power, and that power was oppressed. He was kind of bumbling in the movie. For those of you who have read the book, he's more menacing, right? In the Wonderful Wizard of Oz, more of a negative character that the wizard is. So looking like, how did L. Frank Baum get to this point? So L. Frank Baum's mother-in-law was Matilda Jocelyn Gage. Matilda Jocelyn Gage was right there with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. She's in that picture with them. She wrote the first 3 volumes of the women's history of the United States with them. Now, she's not often remembered as much. And one of the reasons for that is she had a division with the women's suffrage movement. As time went on, the women's suffrage movement started to associate itself with temperance and religious motivation, trying to stop alcohol. And Matilda Jocelyn Gage disagreed with that. She wrote in her penultimate book, Women, Church, and State, that came out in 1893, it talked about how witch trials were used against women for centuries. In Europe and then in the United States. If someone had power, if someone had money, if someone wouldn't follow, then they would be called a witch. And so this is something when L. Frank Baum created, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, and he created his lead characters as witches, this is something he would have known. Now, L. Frank Baum's relationship with his mother-in-law was very strained at first because in 1892 or 1891, his aunt says, you have to go to this party. You have to meet Maud Gage. You'll absolutely love her. And usually in this time period, women would be expected to demur away and laugh, but she looked him in the eye and said, because he said, well, Miss Gage, consider yourself loved. And she didn't go and look away. She looked him right in the eye and said, I consider that a promise, Mr. Baum. And that was dictated their relationship. But at this time, he was in one of his businesses that was not doing well. He was a traveling playwright, and she was one of the first female students at Stanford. And Matilda Jocelyn Gage was not impressed with her daughter dropping out of Stanford to marry a traveling playwright. She didn't grow to love him, and she never got to see him be successful. She passed away before he started writing, but she was actually the one who ended up saying that, you really should write these fantastical stories that you tell your children. And so she really played a role in that as well. But in Maud Gage's marriage vows to L. Frank Baum, it actually made the papers that there was no talk of submission. And so actually this concept that throughout their whole marriage, they were seen as a marriage of equals, was something that was important to him. And as we'll talk about in his different jobs, when he wrote newspapers, women's suffrage was important to him. Next, we'll talk about when they moved to the Dakotas, Maud Gage and L. Frank Baum. And during this time period, when they realized women's suffrage, they might not have realized why the American West was accepting this first, but they did realize it was happening. And so people like Susan B. Anthony, they came to give different talks in the American West. And they actually stayed at L. Frank Baum's house. And so it's certainly powerful that 20 years before women could vote, that this man who was influenced by the women's suffrage movement. And in Matilda Jocelyn Gage's book, too, she really talks about something. I've read this book and something that's horrific in it. In 1893, the age of consent in Delaware was 7. And so 7 years old was the age of consent. And so she fought so hard that it wasn't just about getting the right to vote. It was about getting the right to vote to protect women. And L. Frank Baum has a lot of quotes where he talks about how he thinks women could rule better than men, that he believes that if women were in charge and in power. And so that dynamic in Oz, where our hero is a heroine, and that our power truly comes from the witches. All right, so that leads to my next portion, which is going to look at the Homestead Act and the Wonderful Wizard of Oz. So I'm going to sing a song, and I want you to raise your hand at the end if you've heard it and what you think about. Somewhere over the rainbow, way up high, there's a place that I heard of once in a lullaby. Somewhere over the rainbow, bluebirds fly. Birds fly over the rainbow. Why then, why can't I? Someday I'll wish upon a star and wake up where the clouds are far behind me, where trouble melts like lemon drops away above the chimney tops. That's where you'll find me. Somewhere over fly over the rainbow. Why then why can't I? Anybody not know that song? No, so that's even like when I talk to kids, if they haven't seen that movie, people know that song. And when we're looking at this, right, it's even if you hadn't heard it, even if you haven't seen the part where she runs away, knowing like wants to see what's out there, lamenting her circumstances, thinking that there's something magical somewhere else. And something that's interesting, L. Frank Baum struggled with money. So he went back to Oz many, many times. We're only talking about the first book, but he talked about how he was just the narrator of Oz. He truly believed the world existed in his mind and he just brought people to it. But the movie, this powerful song, you think about books being turned into movies, and it's always different. It has to be. It's a very different medium. Whether it's Harry Potter or any of your favorite books that's turned into movies. Now, that song was a smart choice because it is truly the most famous part of that movie. But it was an addition of the producer. In the book, The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, she doesn't lament Kansas. Kansas is only about 11 pages. Now, it was this movie when it came out in 1939, almost 40 years after the book. It was the first movie that had color. And that was perfect because in L. Frank Baum's book, Kansas was gray. He says it was gray, the sun baked the prairie grass gray and the crops gray and the wood from the house was small because it had to be brought in. And Aunt M came a beautiful housewife, but now her cheeks were sunken in from all the hard work. And then she's taken away. And so that's something that's so fascinating. It's not a lament. It's very much historian Richard White like talks about it as this like apocalyptic world, like this very difficult something we have here at the park, because that's the reality of homesteading. But she didn't lament it, right? She was on a farm. She was living and she was on a homestead in Kansas, and it was hard. It was hard work. They were working all hours. It affected them in their livelihood, but she never wanted to leave. But then she's brought to Oz, where it's lush and it's green. And historian Richard White points out that Oz is the promise. It's what the Homestead Act was supposed to be. If you come here to the park, you'll see these ads that literally have like cornucopias full of fruit. It shows money falling out of a plow, like rain follows the plow. The promise of the Homestead Act is what you are going to get is just abundance and wealth. And the reality was it was hard and gray and a lot of work. But while she never lamented Kansas, one thing that stayed the same is home. The second she got there, she was given the promise of the Homestead Act, but she wanted to be home. And this isn't just a strong, independent girl who's leading a story in 1900, 20 years before women could vote. She's a girl that was born and raised on the homestead, raised on the American farm. She has empathy, right? She meets people along the way who need help. And instead of turning them away, she's analytical and empathetic, and she asks them to join her. I think it's so powerful, this element of the home, because truly it was the American dream. And, Kansas has gotten a lot for it, right? They have, there's no place like home, and they have the Wizard of Oz Museum. In reality, when we're looking at L. Frank Baum's life, L. Frank Baum only ever went to Kansas once when he was traveling with Maud as part of the traveling play, right? As they were going, and they just said it was gray, or it was just grass. But what he did experience was Aberdeen, Dakota Territory. So in 1892, L. Frank Baum's sister-in-law, Matilda Jocelyn Gage's daughter, Julia Gage Carpenter, moves with her husband to Edgeley, Dakota Territory, which then became North Dakota, and starts a homestead. a lot of the Gage family moved to South Dakota Territory. And his brother-in-law, Maud's brother, starts the general store there. In 1888, L. Frank Baum got one of the greatest technologies. It was still very big, but it was the first handheld Kodak camera. It was a box. But he went to visit his in-laws, fell in love, and took his family to Dakota Territory, where he opened Baum's Bazaar. Now, there was already a general store because his brother-in-law owned it. But he created a store, Baum's Bazaar, that was all the luxuries of the East Coast. So you could have lamps, you could have carpets, and all of these things, and people loved it. So much so he was able to open a second location. But when times get hard, what's the first thing that goes? It's going to be the luxuries. So he ends up losing both stores. He writes for a paper. He actually owns a paper for a while where he's writing about women's rights, but he's also, one point, he goes and sees how difficult things are on his family's homestead. He covers a wedding of Germans from Russia. So there was a people group who first immigrated under protections of Catherine the Great, who was a German princess, for about 100 years in the Volga area of Russia. But they started to lose those protections under Tsar Nicholas I. And so then they immigrate to the United States. But for 100 years, they're able to maintain their own churches and not have military service, their own language. Then they come to the United States. And the specific people that this wedding he goes to, they're extremely poor. The poverty is very difficult for them. Their homestead is difficult. It's rocky in Dakota, but he talks a lot about the joy and the tradition and the pride in what they have. And he truly becomes to love Aberdeen. And that's something that is very hard for him when the paper fails. They can't stay anymore. So they have to move to Chicago. And he ends up moving to Chicago and starts doing window dressings. And that's when the Chicago World Fair happens. So when we look at Oz was actually mirrored after the World Fair. Because, this World Fair had this beautiful white city, but behind the facade, right, is the poverty and the hardship and the difficulties that they faced. So he ends up having to move to Chicago, and he ends up writing for basically a magazine that does window dressings. And his mother-in-law moves in with him for some time. But then after that, she passes away, and then he starts writing and creating these worlds. And I think it's so cool because we look at the different iterations of The Wonderful Wizard of Oz, because the most famous one is the 1939. But if we look at ease on down the road, why don't you ease on down the road? Well, you can't carry nothing that might be a load. Ease on down the road. Well, that's from The Wiz with Michael Jackson and Diana Ross. That came out in the 70s. And it definitely has that 1970s sound. But also, thank you. Also, from that same musical, there's the song, when I think of home, I think of a place where there is love overflowing. I wish I was home. I wish I was back there with the things I've been knowing. And so this concept of home and a place that belongs to you is also very clear through all the different iterations. But then we look at how this world exists even beyond his original books, right? The second version of Wicked is coming out, which started as a book and then became a musical in 2002. And that musical then was turned into a movie. But that strong, independent, strong female character who is empowered stays the same. So that's when we hear, I'd sooner bite, defying gravity. Kiss me goodbye, I'm defying gravity, and you can't hold me down. Don't you see, you understand, you're having delusions of grandeur. I'm sick of accepting limits, 'cause someone says there's so. Some things I cannot change, but till I try, I'll never know. So even though that's so separated, right? We're looking at literally 1900 till 2003, that that thread of that strong, independent woman, that analytical, who's having to what confront the society that she's living in, confront the power structure. And there was also in 2018, there was kind of a gritty NBC series called Oz that looked at all the different elements of the Wizard of Oz too, the future books. And so this world is a key part of American history, and truly American culture. And I think, you can see those threads throughout the different iterations, just in different ways. And so with that, I would love to, I think it's really a lot of value in opening it up to kind of the second half being a dialogue. So if anybody has any questions.
I just want to say how great it is to have you interpret all these different odds. I hadn't thought of it in that depth, and it's great. Thank you very much for
Oh,
doing
I'm
that.
so glad. Yeah, so I think that this is something,
I'm sorry, Amber. Deborah has her hand up. Sorry
oh,
about you.
perfect. That's lovely. Yes.
I've got to unmute myself. Um, uh, my great grandfather was an immigrant,
Yes.
and his first child in my genealogy was apparently born in 1876.
Okay.
The Homestead Act, 1862. When did it end? When could you sort of no longer take advantage
So
of it,
that's
or
a
could
really
people?
good question. And it started in 1863. It was signed into law in 62. It
Oh,
didn't end in the state of Alaska until 1986. It was active 123 years. Although, when we're looking at the Homestead Act, the traditional homesteading lands, right, where the way that we think about it, where you selected your land, you went and improved it, really most of that land was gone by the 1940s, except for Alaska, where you could still traditionally. But there's later, where they started irrigating further out west, and then they opened homesteading up to, just veterans could qualify for these plots, but they had to have experience. But for the most part, when we're thinking of traditional homesteading, in Alaska, it was till 1986, but most of that land was taken in the lower 48 by the 40s.
by the 40s. So if my great grandfather, who was an immigrant from Alsace-Lorraine, first child was born in 1876,
Yeah,
maybe we can take advantage of this. Or what part of the country? Because I think they didn't settle out as far west as Nebraska.
well,
My
let me
geography
show
is
you the map because it really truly was. So my family actually, none of them went to Nebraska. I had family that went to Wisconsin and family that went to Minnesota. But something they really wanted to, because during this time period, when we're looking, the Republican Party is a coalition in the 1850s when they're developing. Of the Liberty Party that's against slavery, the Free Soil Party that wants to see individual landowners on the American West, because a lot of the Civil War was about expansion into the would it be slave, would it be free in the American West. Now, one of the groups that was absorbed into this coalition was the Know Nothings. Now, they were called the Know Nothings because if someone asked about this group or this political association, they say, I know nothing. But what they were they were nativists. They were anti-immigration. But the people that were most for the Homestead Act. We've got what was known as the radical Republicans, right? Thaddeus Stevens, Benjamin Wade, Charles Sumner, and they want this to be as inclusive as possible. So by the time this act is signed, the Civil War already went on a lot longer than anyone anticipated. And so because of that, the people, even though there was no nothings, they were able to leverage, like, we need new soldiers, right? We want to entice people here. And so that's why they were able to successfully leverage to have it open to people wanting to become citizens. And they actually put circulars out, so in different languages and in different countries, to try to get people to come. And oftentimes they would travel in groups. And so, like, the Czech capital of the United States is about 30 minutes from me. It's called Wilbur, Nebraska. If you've ever heard of the homesteading book, My Antonia by Willa Cather, it actually, yes, yeah, considered one of the 100 by the Library of Congress influential books in the United States. And, you know, they go to Wilbur, Nebraska in this, and they end up taking over a dugout of a homesteader. But Wilbur was because a lot of people came on the promise of the Homestead Act. My family is Ashkenazi, or European Jewish on my father's side. They didn't homestead. My mother's side homesteaded. But we know from research, you know, Ashley, North Dakota, in the beginning of the 20th century, was able to support 2 synagogues because so many people fled from what is modern day Ukraine in the Odessa area to Ashley, North Dakota, because at this time period, it was against the law for people who were identified as Jewish to own land, but they could come to the United States and earn, 160 acres. And so, like, there was an entire community. There's still a cemetery there. We've been doing work on Black homesteading communities. Nicodemus is a National Park Service site because formerly enslaved people ended up taking part of this as well. And so there's different communities. Even we have our Winter Festival of Prairie Cultures. I'm actually in the process of working with our volunteers to get it set up. And it has little vignettes like from, France. We've got our Great Plains Indigenous display, Germany, Italy, all these different countries of the traditions they brought with them. And there's so many, if you look out through the homesteading states, of these communities that still have Swedish roots, or still have Czech roots, still have, because they homesteaded together, because they saw all these circulars. And, Lindsborg, Kansas is the Swedish capital of the United States. And they have Swedish dancers today that, travel around and still remember. They have the St. Lucia Day Festival and still remember all those different traditions. Now, something, and I can send you a link to, it is actually quite easy to find out if your family successfully homesteaded. It's harder to find out if they started because there isn't as clear of a record and it's held in different places. Something amazing, though, is the Bureau of Land Management has the GLO, the GLO records. If you go to blm.glo.gov, also, I will sometimes just search GLO records in Google, GLO. And there's a database. Anything under the General Land Office, which all homesteads are, but not just homesteads, military service, mining claims, purchases, can be found sometimes with just a state and a last name. You can narrow it to county. This database is very easy to use. Now, because homesteading had really specific requirements, it's actually created this huge repository of genealogical information. So in 10 of the homesteading states, including Nebraska, on Ancestry.com, there's a specific database where before 1908, you can find all that paperwork. And so it's, what did they plant? What kind of house did they have? You could actually apply your military service if you served for the Union up to 4 years. So military service paperwork's in those. We see naturalizations, since you had to be a citizen before you completed it, not when you started. So there's these really amazing, and they exist for all 30 homesteading states. But I'll definitely be for sure that Chastity has I will send a document that has links, but also be for sure she has my email address, because I'm happy to try to help you find your family. If you do find a homestead, it's not digitized online. There is a way. It's for a fee with you have to actually go through the National Archives, but to pull the hard copies. But it's really fascinating, and it's really easy and free to check if you have homesteading. And even if it's not homesteading, if you have family that got land directly from the federal government, we can find you that land patent where you can see that primary document they got.
Wow.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
That was an excellent presentation, by the way.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I love musical theater too, and referring to all those different musicals was a lot of fun for me. My mom had told me that when Wizard of Oz came out, color had just come to the
Yes.
theater, and watching it in the even thinking about it now, and her being a little girl seeing it, I think she was 9 when it came out. And she said the whole thing was gray, and then all of a
Yes.
sudden it's Oz,
Yes.
and it was color. And she said the ah that happened in the movie theater of people all around seeing color in front of them. For her, she used to say, I think heaven is going to be like that. She's passed on now. So,
I love
but
that.
she used to refer to that, and talking with the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren, it's all the colors. So, and I used to really enjoy hearing her say, but my question is, you said they were enticing people, and I got confused about,
Sure.
there was a group that was saying, no, no, no immigrants. And I know we have so much of that
Yes.
same kind of tension that still has continued 100+ years later, right? But there was the group, and they were called the Know Nothings. Is that right? Because they would say
Yeah.
I know nothing, not
Yes.
because they knew nothing, but because
But they say I know
knew
nothing. So what happened was, because the fall of the Whig Party, which with Henry Clay was considered the head of the Whig Party, when he
Okay.
passed away,
And that was what, 59? When did he pass away?
I believe, well, I think it was like 52, because there's the compromise
Okay.
of 50, which he did, because he
Okay.
really was always trying to be a negotiator. But Abraham Lincoln was actually a Whig before he was a Republican. And
Right.
one of his key idols, his political idols, was the compromiser, Henry Clay. And Henry Clay was a complicated figure. He's from Kentucky. He's a slave owner, but he wanted to see this avenue but he also was not a supporter of a Homestead Act. But he was a supporter of, starting way back in the 1820s, with John Quincy Adams, was the American system, internal improvements. And so, like, when we look at what Abraham Lincoln was able to accomplish, because they created the railroad within months, they had college land grants, the Homestead Acts, it actually had so many Whiggish qualities in the sense of being, internal improvements. Now, while the Know Nothings were part and folded into the Republican Party, the Liberty Party, and which was like the anti-slave party, the Free Soil, like all these different voices. But some of those Know Nothings were in Congress. They eventually ended up being in the fold because the pragmatic argument of we need more soldiers ended up helping that be included. But something that's so interesting, most people have never heard of Benjamin Wade. Has anybody heard of Benjamin Wade?
Mm-mm.
So Benjamin Wade was one of the radical Republicans, as they are known, right? They wanted to have as inclusive of policy as possible, to be for sure that Reconstruction was empowering. And Andrew Johnson, after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, he actually was a huge proponent of the Homestead Act, but a more limited like white male. And he starts being extremely sympathetic to the South. He was only added to the ticket. He was Andrew Johnson, who became president after Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. He was only vice president for a little bit. Hamlin was his vice president before. It was to get this Southern vote. But he starts really quickly, pardoning people. And so the radical Republicans are starting to override this. And they actually impeach him for trying to get rid of the Secretary of War. And he is impeached. And in the Senate, he was one vote away from being removed from office.
Mm-hmm.
But Benjamin Wade, nobody's heard of him, but he was radical
that
Republican.
guy.
But because, and a couple of votes made a difference because they were like, so he was so close to being president, but wasn't. But we really do see under Andrew Johnson kind of the crumbling of a lot of these intentions and policies. The Southern Homestead Act was supposed to be this promise of like 40 acres and a mule, like actual opportunity. But we see the putting in place of these horrific black codes, making it very difficult. So yes, but basically it's the government, but also at the same time, the railroads are given large tracts of land and they're also trying to sell them too. So the federal government is advertising, but so is the railroads trying to get people here too. So they is actually kind of a coalition.
Okay, thank you. That's very helpful.
Yeah, sorry, I got a little off on the soapbox.
I appreciated learning that
history.
other background stuff too. So thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I unmuted myself. History was just about my least favorite subject and next to physical education. So I got just focused because your grandmother born in 1924, so that was 2 years before my mother was born. But just the Homesteading Act, because my great grandfather was an immigrant and trying maybe right now the people that would reliably be able to inform me of stuff like that have passed away. And
I think I can help you, Debbie. I'll be for sure you have my email.
Okay, but this is the 40 acres and a mule. It was an opportunity to own land because when I tuned in, I was sort of the Wizard of Oz. From what I remember having read that years and years and years ago, because that was kind of because history is good. I mean, this is very educational. It's just that I'm not kind of oriented to history. There was a scene in the Wizard of Oz, a section where they finally found the wizard behind the curtains or something.
He was a fake.
Sort of an ordinary man or something.
Yes. Yeah. So he was the bumbling, and that's something that's in the book and the movie is this concept of the man's supposed to have all the power under the structured system. He does have the power, but he's actually a bumbling fake. He doesn't have innate power, right? Like magic, the way, and the idea, like even whether it was the Southern Homestead Act, the Homestead Act, this concept of 40 acres and a mule. It's this idea of, I truly believe, and Richard White argues as well, it's the idea of a place that belongs to you. So a place that's your home, a place you can cultivate, but then also the mule would be the tools to do so. But
it's more the land than the building. And a squatter what is a squatter?
Yeah. So, okay. So even then, squatters' rights end up getting passed into law. So a squatter is somebody who goes to land before it's surveyed. So like with Laura Ingalls Wilder and stuff, like whether that's still like the indigenous title hasn't been extinguished or it has been extinguished, but they go and they squat. This was happening so quickly that people are moving west faster than the land surveyed, that they actually were able to advocate in 1848 to have preemption laws, which is a squatter's law, saying that the first person on the land has first right to that land. Now, at the time, the law was, by the time it was surveyed, then you could get it for $1.25 an acre, which was the price set in 1820. But what would happen is people would squat, then it would be surveyed. They didn't have the $1.20 an acre, so someone else would buy it. And then we see these squatter clubs come up, where they're like kind of vigilantes trying to get the legal land title owner off since they were the squatter. Once the Homestead Act is opened, those squatter laws, the preemption law, turns into you can homestead. So if you are on the land before it's surveyed, once it's surveyed, then you have first right to homestead it. And it is about land, but land is opportunity. Like when looking at Europe, the way they see it, like whoever owned the land was the noble class, and it was the opportunity, and land represented home because it was a place that was yours.
Yeah. I think in Baltimore we had dollar houses and things. So this is more land, not like somebody. But
Yeah,
it wasn't in the Wizard of Oz because that's that was the book, a story like that, very fantasy. The Tin Man wanted a heart, was it?
yeah. And
Yeah.
that's something, so I don't go into, there's a lot of different work that has been done that explores the different parts of like the Gilded Age, and also initially in the book, the shoes are silver and the path is gold, and like the silver standard versus the gold standard. But something that is very clear is, that he was influenced, L. Frank Baum was influenced by his life and his beliefs and the people that were around him. And I think that that's reflected in that story. And I think that the way that it kind of embodied these like American values and the American dream is part of why, in my opinion, it still resonates.
Yeah. Just so you know, in the second house that I ever bought had ground rent. Okay, here in Maryland, if you
Uh-huh.
know what ground rent is. Okay. The nobles that made claim to the
Uh-huh.
land in Maryland and other of the eastern states, like Calvert, they were nobles in England. They owned the land all the way up until, well, actually, it was in 1995 that I bought the house that
Wow.
had ground rent that I was paying that
Sure.
went
Yes.
back
Yes.
to England, to the noble in England
Yes.
that owned the land.
Renters fee. Yes.
Okay.
That's amazing. Well, I was thinking, I thought you were talking about like a certain type of stone. Yes. And that's something too, especially when looking at the expansion and this idea of getting actual settlers on the public domain became very important now to the American West to kind of challenge that mindset. And even I was able to buy my first home back in 2020. And even though it's not a lot of land, this concept of like, this is my place. This is my home. And like, I see even all these years later, it truly is my American dream.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Thank you
Okay.
very much.
Okay, Amber, I just got to know what's the story on Wicked then? And for those who don't or not follow, Wicked is
Okay.
like the prequel of The
It's a
Wizard of
prequel.
Oz.
It was written as a book in the 90s. The book is darker than the musical. And it's it's the origin story. So Elphaba, who sings the song I sang, is the Wicked Witch of the West. And Glinda is the Wicked Witch in the South. But in the end, in the book, there's actually 4 witches. Too good, too bad. But it's how they meet each other. But then it shows the wizard as more sinister, and the way that he's treating the animals. And Elphaba, the Wicked Witch of the West, isn't actually bad. She's challenging a corrupt system. And so I think that is extremely cool the way that the author of Wicked and then the way it was translated to the musical, it's many iterations later, right? First in book, then a musical, then a movie musical, but is able to kind of this, that core part of having to look at the power structure, looking at your own decisions, having these strong female leads. They're both complicated, right? I think it's really cool. And I think it's neat because it's something that's bringing this world to a new generation.
Thank you so much.
Well, Chastity, I will be for sure to get you that document because I have a document with a link where you can go to those general land office records for free. And I'll also be for sure, you are all welcome to my email. I'd be happy to help anyone try to find land patents for their family.
Well, thank you. I'll look forward to it. And for those of you who are joining us, I promise I will pass anything along that Amber sends to me. I promise, because this was fabulous. I thought the first time was a great rendition, minus the songs, because, Rob couldn't sing, but that's respectful, and neither can I. But now, even hearing it a second time, it's like hearing it anew. So thank you
Oh,
very
good.
much. Really,
Yeah.
both of you
Thank
make a
you.
great pair. Thank
Oh,
you.
thank you.
Yes,
Have
thank
a
you
great
very
day.
much.
Yes,
Oh,
thank
thank you so
That's
much.
great.
And thank
Yes.
you all for joining us today. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules too. So thanks. We
Girlie,
just
you made
traveled.
my day. I love this program. So thank you for engaging with it and letting me give it to you.
You
Okay.
can tell. It's obvious. So thanks, Amber.
Thank you.
Take care,
Bye-bye.
everybody.